Right. So if you remember from our last session, we had kind of three main takeaways from that, and that is that Quill is all about the document. We're servants of the end user, and that Quill is a worldwide community. So for today's training session, we're going to focus on documents and what is best practice when it comes to rendering them into Quill. So at the heart of the Quill platform is an exploration of how negotiated texts arrive at their final form. So many of the constitutions that we work with aren't obscure documents. So the final versions of these texts are available online and studied in schools, and they're researched and written about a lot. But like we said in the last training session, Quill doesn't aim to offer another reproduction of a document that users can access in several other places, though they can if they choose to. What Quill aims to do is demonstrate the sort of gestation of these documents, so how they came to be what they are, kind of amendment by amendment, speech by speech. Researchers, legal practitioners, and teachers all come to Quill with different interests. A lot of you are political scientists or aspiring lawyers, so you probably know better than I do that there are certain phrases in these documents that researchers or legal practitioners find especially interesting, whether that's because they have several different interpretive possibilities, or because they bear upon some legal issue, or maybe they're just very contentious, or they're an interesting puzzle, like the example on this slide, which shows a famous phrase from the Bill of Rights that changed from one draft to another, but without any acknowledgement or explanation. So Quill can show us how these phrases came to be, when they were first proposed, what people had to say about them in context, and the various attempts that people made to change them, whether or not those attempts were successful, what other issues were being discussed alongside them, etc. So it can help make clear what we do and don't know about these documents, like in the example above. So when it comes to interpretations of constitutions, whether in research or in a legal setting, it can be important to know what the text under discussion looked like at any given time. There are famous speeches made during the 1787 convention that are used today to justify certain interpretations of the Constitution. But interestingly, some of those speeches refer to pieces of text that were not incorporated into the Constitution at all. So in other words, they were speeches on rejected proposals being used to justify the final text. So Quill can provide that necessary context so we can understand these documents deeper. Some researchers are interested in how involved certain committees or individuals were in contributing to a piece of text. Some researchers are interested in the other texts that a convention consulted in the negotiation of a document, and Quill can provide those texts too. So when we model a negotiation, we're able to demonstrate how other texts influence the main text under discussion, not just how people, offered up amendments on the spot. So there are three factors to consider when rendering documents into Quill. One is good research practice, good editorial practice, and good modeling practice. So as you're modeling a project and working with documents, it's helpful to think about whether you're adhering to best practice in all of these areas. So the first step in making sure that we're practicing good research when we represent documents in Quill is to take a survey of available materials and locate as many texts as possible. So we touched on this briefly in the last session, and as you'll have an in-depth training session on archive visits and management at some point, I won't spend too much time on this. Last time I spoke about consulting many different resources in order to fill in gaps in the record and to create a robust digital edition. But I'm coming at it from a slightly different point of view today. If we're thinking about how texts of a negotiated document evolve to arrive at their final versions, we can't ignore the other texts that enter a convention that bear upon the negotiation. These documents can be petitions, messages, manifestos, pamphlets, other pieces of legislation, and they tend to be mentioned or described in the journal or the official record, whatever you're consulting. So-and-so presented a petition, or so-and-so referred to a clause from their pamphlet entitled whatever. These are all documents that you'd create a create document event for in the timeline. So I've included some screenshots on this slide of examples from some of the projects I'm working on. So one is the Government of India Act. So in this negotiation, the delegates refer to this document over and over again throughout the convention, and they propose sections to their constitution that are lifted directly from this document. And the other screenshot is a petition to the Australian Convention from the mayor of a town in New South Wales, which asks the convention to consider a location for the federal territory. So in other words, this is a document that asks the convention to consider incorporating a piece of text into the Constitution. And in that way, it's a proposal of sorts. So the provisions from these documents may or may not be incorporated into the final document, but they represent a potential influence on the document being negotiated. So at the very least, they represent texts that the delegates had before them, texts that potentially informed an amendment they proposed or a speech that they made. And generally speaking, we want to propose that where possible. There are some exceptions, though. I'm not sure if any of you worked on the civil rights amendments projects, but in those negotiations, Congress made an explicit decision to file petitions as they were received. So in other words, they made an explicit decision not to read the petitions. So in that case, we made an editorial decision not to create the document events in the timeline for petitions that Congress didn't read and wasn't referring to in its decision making. So the option remained to us editorially to add them as resource items in a resource collection, but we didn't want to imply an influence in the timeline where there wasn't one. But if there's one thing to take away from this slide, it's that using the text is missing text as a document text is an absolute last resort. So this is something we're trying to improve across all projects, here in Oxford included. And it's something that's on our mind as we get underway with the Australia project, for example, where it's very physically difficult for us to access archives. And that's something that, you may encounter too, working on state constitutions where the archives are kind of spread far and wide. So Elizabeth will talk later about parsing the record, but I want to touch briefly on being faithful to the record. So it's obvious to all of us that we shouldn't make false claims in our work. So that's not what I'm talking about here. In these projects, we're trying to mimic as closely as possible the behavior of a convention. So sometimes the delegates do things that don't make logical sense, or they get confused and contradict themselves, or they break their rules by doing something that they said they wouldn't do. And it's not our job as researchers to tone down these moments or wrangle them into a sequence that is more logical. We're interested not in how a convention should have behaved, but in how they actually did behave. So yes, we want our projects to be intuitive for users, but we also shouldn't sacrifice the integrity of the record. So if somebody moves the same amendment twice, or if they get confused about the text that's under consideration and they propose something kind of completely off the wall, then we want to stay faithful to that record. So lastly, on best research practice, we have to be very intentional in justifying any assumptions that we make. Ruth spoke about neutrality in our last session, so it's absolutely essential in order for our research to be of the highest quality that we maintain neutrality in our work. And related to that, the decisions we make in the model have to be justified by source material. Justifying our inferences or assumptions assures users of our neutrality by demonstrating how we've relied on the available source material. It also legitimizes our decisions. So whenever you're forced to make an assumption in Quill, you have to ask yourself, do you definitely have the evidence to support the claim that you're making? And if you do, then you have to provide this evidence for the user. So we can't just say, we can assume X, Y, Z, and then expect everybody to take our word for it. Everything must be cited in an authoritative academic way. So with that in mind, steer clear of using the word assuming. Even if we are making an assumption, the word assuming doesn't really imply like an evidence-based decision. So I'm personally a big fan of infer. It seems a bit more like taken stock of all the available resources and you've made an informed decision. And then if you don't have the evidence from the sources to back up your claim, then simply don't make the claim. So next, we will talk about best editorial practice. So the editorial side of reproducing documents is one of those things that people will really only notice if we do it badly. So at the simplest level, editorial best practice is important because people like to use tools that look good and that are intuitive. But on a deeper level, the editorial details are the fine details that make a project look professional and that really make or break a faithful reproduction of a document. So the editorial elements of reproducing documents are things like accuracy and attention to detail. So for example, making sure the text of documents are error-free when you first add them in Quill. This is an important step not only for the publication stage of these projects, but also for the working stage. So finding an error in a base document when you're 50 amendments down the line could mean a lot of work for you to correct later, but it could also mean, a potential corruption of the document, and then all the work that you've done up until that point is gone. Another thing to think about is formatting. So have you maintained the intentional formatting decisions of the document in your transcriptions? So these screenshots are an excerpt from a newspaper that's been used as description text, but this also applies to document text. So you can see that this text that's being used as a heading is actually part of the sentences that span the lines before and after. The bottom screenshot is the way that this text was originally entered into Quill. And even though the formatting of the newspaper is strange, we need to maintain it when we reproduce it in Quill. But to clarify, this doesn't mean that you have to maintain like arbitrary line breaks. You don't need to have the exact number of words per line in your document as in the original, just those that were clearly done on purpose. And then sometimes when you OCR text, I'm sure you've all come across this, the text that's produced from the OCR has these weird line breaks. So, we just want to tidy those up. It looks better that way. People like to use things that look good. Sometimes there are grammar and spelling mistakes in the record, either because a delegate used poor grammar or the clerk or the printer, misspelled a word or whatever. In being faithful to the record, we must quote the text as it reads, errors and all. So what we do in those instances is use sic in square brackets. So this is a Latin abbreviation from the phrase, okay, you're going to have to excuse my Latin pronunciation, but sic erat scriptum, which means thus it had been written. So essentially, this is just a common procedure editorially to indicate that the error is original to the text, to the source material, and not to you. So using sic applies to description text and never, ever to document text. So if you come across a misspelling in document text, you need to check the journal or the record that you're referring to see whether it's a spelling error that is corrected down the line. So sometimes this happens where somebody says, oh, there's been a printing error. This word that's plural should be singular or something like that. And in that case, you would keep the error in the original document. If it's not an error that is explicitly corrected in the record, then you can make the correction. But this doesn't apply to things like archaic spellings. So if they spell a word in a weird way, you can leave it. Like this one, wrapped. This is just an older way of spelling that word. They didn't misspell it. So you don't need to put sic there or correct it. Okay. So moving on to best modeling practice. So creating a Quill model has a lot of moving parts, and we don't really have time to get into all of them in this session today. So we're going to focus on some of the trickier parts of modeling documents, because making sure that we model documents to the best possible standards is one of the most important factors in Quill's ability to facilitate research. Yep. Okay. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth now.
Yeah. So Understanding what actually went on in the negotiation from the relevant sources and how to create and translate these events into Quill's digital model is probably one of the most challenging aspects of creating a digital edition in Quill. And whether or not to use the two-document method is a question that often comes up. So many of you will be very familiar with the two-document method, but just to quickly recap, it's the method we use for capturing line-by-line revisions or section-by-section considerations of a document. And so a new blank document is created, and that will be the revised version when it's finished. And then as each section comes up for discussion, the original section is proposed onto the new document as a new amendment, which is accordingly accepted or rejected. And usually this process continues until the entire document has been revised. So the example on screen is from the Arizona Constitutional Convention, and it shows the moment when the plenary convention began to consider a draft, a convention that's been a draft constitution that's been amended by the committee of the whole and then reported back to them section by section. So when do we need it? Sometimes the record doesn't explicitly note that the committee is considering a document section by section, especially if the consideration of the document in this manner stretches over a number of sessions. So it's good to be mindful of any clues in the record that suggest that this is what's happening. It can be useful to pay attention to the structure of the votes in this case. So is the committee voting on individual sections and in addition to any amendments proposed to these sections? If so, then the two-document method is required. Then an obvious one is is the word several used? If a document's being considered severally, it is being considered section by section. Or if there are motions to take up the document section by section, some journals won't always record the successful votes on these motions for the sake of concision. So you can't always assume that a motion without a corresponding adopt vote necessarily failed. So if there is a motion to take up the document section by section, even if it isn't explicitly adopted, be mindful that the document might be being considered severally and look for other evidence in the record to support this. And finally, are there any votes rejecting particular sections of a document? In order to be concise, some journals might only record negative votes on sections, and they might pass over sections that are adopted into the document without explicitly noting that they were adopted. So if this is the case, then it's likely that the intervening sections of the document that were passed over in the record were put to a vote and adopted. So you might want to use the two-document method there. Motions to strike out can occur when a document is being considered section by section. And striking out text which has not yet been adopted into the working document can cause confusion because there are potentially two different ways of modeling it. Either you can see on the left of the screen by proposing an amendment that deletes the section and then adopting that amendment, or as illustrated on the right of the slide, by creating a procedural motion with an additional decision to reject the proposed section and adopting the motion. When you're modeling the revision of a document using the two-document method and you come across a motion to strike out, use the second method, the procedural motion with a reject subdecision. This basically avoids you having to use a counterintuitive vote to adopt the empty section into the document. So it's easier for users to follow. And sometimes, like when the convention deletes sections of a document, it can mess up the numbering of a document. But don't worry about like renumbering the sections if there isn't an indication that they were renumbered in the record, because usually they'll get renumbered when the document becomes engrossed later in this negotiation. So another thing I find really useful when kind of trying to understand what's going on in the record and how to model it is to consider the wider effect of the event. Occasionally attempting to fit events of the record too rigidly into Quill's model can cause issues. So the example I have on the slide is a question and answer session from the Illinois Constitutional Convention. And there are a couple of ways that you can model a series of questions as a document. For example, you could create a conjectural document of statements based off of the proposals that the questions are kind of implicitly asking the convention to decide upon, and then accept or reject these statements accordingly. And Lauren a bit later is going to explain more about conjectural documents. But for this example, I'm sticking with how you would model this question as in a list of question and answers. So the question is, should the State Central Committee be unrestricted in its list? And the convention votes no. So if you were trying to fit this neatly into the Quill timeline, it might make sense to propose the question, should the State Central Committee be unrestricted in its list, onto your Q&A document, and then reject it when the convention votes no. However, this kind of makes it seem like the convention were voting no to asking the question instead of voting actually on the question itself. And as such, it wouldn't accurately represent what's going on. If you were to reject all of the questions that the committee voted no on and accept the questions that the committee voted yes on, you'd end up with a list of questions which would arbitrarily depend on whether the convention phrased its questions in a positive or a negative form. So instead, to effectively represent the events of the record, you need to propose the convention's answers as amendments to the document, as I've got on the right of this slide. And so the wider point here is that before alighting on keywords in the record that correspond with certain Quill events, in this case, the words no or reject, it's useful to drill down into what's actually going on in the record and what effect it's having on the text under consideration. And now I'm going to briefly pass over to Lauren.
I'm just going to talk briefly about procedural motions versus documents. So this is kind of a common point of confusion across all projects we do everywhere, is whether to add a motion as a document event or as a procedural motion event. So a good rule to follow is that where text is proposed or where it's clear that a motion was tabled or formally submitted to the secretary. In other words, it was written down and submitted to the secretary's desk, it should be a document. So the screenshots on the left of the screen show an example of this from the Australia Convention. This is the sort of motion that when it's offered on the spot, we tend to add as a procedural motion. But in this instance, and in this project more generally, motions are submitted first in writing and then they're formally moved. So in that case, this has been presented as a document. So generally, we prefer to use documents over procedural motions where possible. But if you're stuck on whether or not something should be a document or whether it should be a procedural motion, then there is a very helpful flowchart. It's kind of towards the end of the data entry manual. And kind of further to this, we have all of these document subtypes, which you're no doubt familiar with, but the document subtypes are intended to categorize different types of document along the timeline to help users identify different types of texts that were being circulated and sort of obviate the need for procedural motions in certain circumstances. So because you've probably used these, I'm just going to give like a very brief run through of what each one is, just so that we're all on the same page, and then I'll hand it back over to Elizabeth. So we've got resolutions. So these are motions presented in writing, and they typically begin with resolved that XYZ or just that XYZ. Legislation can include both drafts of bills of legislation, bills under consideration, or acts. Messages are for internal communications, so instructions between committees, announcements, etc. Press releases are statements to the press. Position papers are documents that outline a person or party's stance on a subject. So these are typically used in the Irish Peace Talks project. So I don't anticipate that these will be useful for state constitutions. Petitions are all communications from external bodies, whether that is a traditional petition, as in like a bunch of signatures, or if that's a congratulatory telegram from the President of the United States or whatever. Rules and orders of business is exactly what it sounds like. So these include rules, standing orders, agendas, what is the committee going to talk about today, that sort of thing. And then we'll get into conjectural documents more a bit later, but these are for moments in the record when it makes sense to model something as a document, but there's no evidence that such a document actually existed. So yeah, back over to Elizabeth.
When modeling documents in Quill, it's important to keep in mind what are the links between pieces of information that we don't want to lose. And one way of preserving these informational links is by modeling the negotiation of a single document in the most continuous and joined up manner possible, i.e. modeling changes to the document as amendments instead of as entirely new documents. This makes the model simpler to understand, as it makes it clear to the user that they're looking at the same document, just at a different point in the negotiation. By modeling documents changes as amendments, it also allows users to see how the text of a document has changed or might change if it's a pending amendment using the track changes feature. And as Lauren said earlier, showing the gestation of a document is one way that Quill goes beyond a standard reproduction of a document. And this would be lost if the new version of the document was created in Quill as a separate document. So there are a few circumstances where it might be unclear whether something should be modeled as an amendment to an existing document or a new document entirely. So one of those situations is if you come across successive draft versions of a particular document. So instead of creating these different versions as separate documents, model the changes between them using document amendments to the draft. And then sometimes lists of amendments might be submitted to a committee. If the list clearly took the form of a written document, model it as a written document, and then attach a shadow document modeling those changes onto the dependent document, i.e. the list that the kind of would be the document that the amendments are trying to change. If a change is made to a document in a later session to the one in which the document first comes up for discussion and amendment, make sure to not create an entirely new document. This change should still be modeled as a document amendment to ensure continuity in the model. Before creating a new document, if you think it hasn't come up before, check whether it's come up earlier in the record, as it might not be explicit from that day's journal. They might not say we're taking up a document we've already amended. Individual amendments might also sometimes be presented as written resolutions. Generally, these should be modeled as document amendments and not created as separate documents. In practice, most proposed amendments would have taken a written form at some point, if only in the secretary's notes. If for a particular editorial reason, you do create the amendment as a separate document, it's crucial to add a shadow document that models the change to the dependent document in order to preserve the link between the amendment and the document that it's trying to change. Quill allows users to trace the passage of documents through a negotiation, and how documents pass through these various bodies of a negotiation, termed committees in Quill, is often of central procedural importance. So think of how in the UK Parliament, for a bill to become law, it must be approved in the same form by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And this toing and froing of amendments to bills between the Commons and Lords, termed parliamentary ping pong, is crucial to ensuring that both houses have an opportunity to scrutinise legislation. And so, yeah, there's a variety of reasons that a document might be referred to a different body. These might be procedural. So usually the rules of a negotiation will set out a path that the document needs to take through the structure of the negotiation. And often the document or documents written by the negotiation will need to be formally approved by different bodies in a specific order in order to be considered legitimate. It might be the reason of representation. So different bodies within the negotiation will represent different social, political, or geographical groups. So I think of the Commons and the Lords, or the North Dakota and the South Dakota Commission in the Joint Commission. And by sending a document via these bodies, different groups are able to have a say in the legislative process. And then expertise is a reason that's probably most relevant in Quill terms in relation to the standing committees in constitutional conventions. So usually delegates who have experience in a certain subject area, such as agriculture, industry, or law, will be chosen as a member of the relevant standing committee that's tasked with drawing up the article, drafting the article on that subject. And so for these reasons, and so that users can trace a document through Quill, it's crucial that documents are created and copied into the correct committees from the correct points. So sometimes gaps in the record we have mean that a document might seem to come up for the first time in a body that it's not actually created in for the first time. So the most common example we deal with in Quill is probably documents that are sent from a particular committee to the convention when we're missing the minutes of the committee. So it's important to be mindful of any indication that a document should be created in a different committee to the one it's first mentioned in, so that the document is built from the correct point, because building it from a different point is kind of very time consuming. As documents move through the negotiation, they might be amended, referred to different committees, or new events might be attached to them. And as such, a single document might consist of multiple different versions of itself with crucially different text. So it's really important that when copying a document from one committee to another, the correct version of the document is copied in. And Quill allows you to copy in the correct version by selecting the particular name of the version you want to copy, and then the committee session and session date that you want to copy it from. And if the document has been referred out more than once in a particular committee session, check you've copied it from the correct refer event. And the related events tab is probably the most useful tab for checking that documents have been created and copied into the correct committees at the moment. So you can find it by clicking on a document event, scrolling across the top of the purple box, which is the one containing the event details, until you come to the related events tab. And then it shows you all of the future events related to that particular document in the committee that you're in, and any copy in events that have taken the document out of the committee that you're in. And except on quite rare occasions, such as when a committee refers a document to two different standing committees at the same time, a document won't need to be copied from the same point twice. So one way to check for mistakes is to follow the path of the document through the negotiation, starting from where it's first created, and then check that there's only one copy document event in that related events tab. If there's multiple copy document events appearing in this tab, it's likely that one of them is a mistake. Yeah, so I'll pass over to Lauren now.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to talk, to wrap us up about conjectural documents. Like, there are sometimes moments in the minutes that describe decisions made in a convention, but it's not clear whether or not these decisions were being drafted into documents for circulation. So I've provided an example in the screenshots from the India project. So the minutes of this particular committee are very sparse, and they describe some decisions made on the structure of the union. And given the nature of the minutes, it's not really clear whether somebody proposed a specific piece of text and then they debated it and amended it, and then they arrived, where they arrived at a text that they then presented. But it is clear that substantive decisions were made. So these decisions are then reported to another committee, and those decisions are taken up one by one by that committee. But again, we don't really have a document that reflects, kind of the output of this committee. There is no report per se. But the decisions that are being made are important, and they're substantive, and they are the basis of drafts and reports that are then presented to the constituent assembly, the convention. So this kind of relates to what Elizabeth has said earlier about maintaining links. So a decision that is made in this committee informs substantive decisions made later in another committee. And if we represented each of these decisions as individual procedural motions, then we would lose that sort of informational link between a decision made in this committee and what ultimately becomes a substantive decision in another committee, which ultimately becomes a draft of the Constitution. And so this is where we use conjectural documents. So a conjectural document is a document, it's a document subtype, and that indicate that even though we're modeling something as a document, we don't actually have a corresponding document in the archives. So these aren't for instances when we haven't been able to find a text of a document that we know exists. So that's when we would use the text is missing in the document text. These are for moments when we need something more permanent than a procedural motion, because decisions are being reached that will resurface later. So procedural motions are just by nature very ephemeral. So when you can't attach a decision made in a procedural motion to, as an ancestor document on a document, but you can with a conjectural document. So like with this document on the slide, you can, they've made these decisions, and then at the point when that document becomes the basis of more substantive decisions that are made in a different committee later on, then we can use an ancestor document to link them, and then that informational link isn't lost. We can see how these ideas that first surfaced in one area kind of went through this decision-making, more informal decision-making process here. But that really informal decision-making process then went on to inform something very formal, and which, showed up again and again and again and again. So I know that was a lot of information about documents in this presentation, but to summarize, so when you're modeling documents in Quill, keep these three factors in mind. So are you following best research practice? So finding the text of all documents possible, being faithful to the record, justifying your assumptions. Are you using best editorial practice and paying attention to detail as you work, and correcting formatting decisions and using SIC appropriately? And are you following best modeling practice? So using the two document method when necessary, mining the contextual information to parse the record, maintaining the correct links between documents.